I'm glad that every one of you is here. Last weekend, we taught on marriage, and I'll tell you this, I was walking and I saw this woman that I know goes to Willow. She is incredible, probably in her late 40s. She walks up to me and I think she's coming in for a hug, so I put my arms like this and she punches me. And she goes, "That's for last weekend's message. You made me and my husband have to go there and talk about difficult, good things." And then she said, "Thanks so much, I appreciate it." And then I realized, this is why Bill doesn't like to hug people. Maybe he has met her before. But if you remember last week, we talked about how whether we're single, whether we are dating, engaged, whether we're married, we've got to be the kind of people who have a philosophy on what it means to fight for oneness. This word one in Hebrew, it's a central word to the Hebrew people. It's the word ahad. It's this mysterious word of two becoming one. Now, all throughout social media this week, we've been kind of teasing out this concept of what we want to go after this week, because there's something that can disrupt this oneness. There's something that can get in the way of this oneness. And again, whether you are married or in a relationship or are single, this issue does affect you. And many of you had different ideas and thoughts of what this top suggestion of a disruption could be, but I'm here just to tell you it's pretty simple. It's money. It's money. Now, many of you probably grew up in a church, and maybe people didn't ever talk about money. Pastors didn't talk about money. I know for much of my life, every weekend that I'd show up, I didn't learn about money. But when you begin to dive into the Gospels, Jesus talks about money in 40% of every parables that he teaches. 40%. And when you flip through the scriptures, money is referenced over 2,000 times. Faith and prayer, 500 times each. Money, 2,000 times. And even you think about this week, this was one of the most difficult weeks for the stock market in the past few years. Dropped 600 plus points. We're even talking about money when it refers to the Super Bowl. Each commercial, 30-second commercial during the Super Bowl will cost in excess of $5 million. That's a lot of Doritos to be sold. 5 million. If you think during the Super Bowl, they're projecting over 100 commercial slots. That's why the Super Bowl takes 9 hours to view. But you're thinking about this. This is over $500 million of revenue. If a 30-second ad costs $5 million, that's $167,000 per second. Per second. Money, it's all around. And I feel like for many of us, if we don't engage with this, what ends up happening is we let culture lead the way. Or for many of us, we don't know how to do it, and we feel the pressure like we should know how to do it. And I feel like for many of us, we're struggling. And when we struggle, then it affects us emotionally, it affects us spiritually, it affects us relationally, it affects us physically. And I believe that through the scriptures, God gives us a way to actually approach and handle and have a right relationship with our money. When I got done with last weekend's teach, Bill was asking me, he said, "Hey, those 4 words that you used, do you use those words in other areas of your life?" And I said, for me, that's the framework. If I have a framework, it's what makes my life work. And what I want to do is I want to use those 4 words again, because I think if you can hold those words, you can know those words, it can be kind of a framework in which you engage with money or relationships or any other difficult issue that happens in our world. You will begin to make better decisions, decisions that are honoring to God. If you remember, the first word was the word ideal. And for me, if I'm gonna be someone who's fighting for oneness in my marriage, fighting for oneness with God, here's the truth. I gotta know what the biblical ideal is. I gotta understand what is the biblical perspective on how we engage with our finances. And I want to give you a passage of scripture from 1 Timothy. And this is going to be kind of our central text for today. And I love 1st and 2nd Timothy because it's Paul, this rabbi, this mentor, and he's been pouring into this young mentee, teaching him about what it means to be human, what it means to live a God-honoring life. And truth be told, the things that he teaches Timothy are so applicable for today. Well, Paul says these words, and it's going to be a verse that I hope every one of you would memorize, that you would share with your kids, and you would just apply to your life. And it's just this, 1 Timothy 6:6. Godliness with contentment is great gain. It's pretty simple, right? Godliness with contentment is great gain. It's actually a math formula too. Godliness plus contentment equals great gain. Now think about, what is godliness? Godliness is simply this. It's you willfully choosing to conform your life to God's ideal. It's you willfully choosing with every facet and area of your life to conform to God's ideal. Now, godliness plus contentment. What's contentment? Contentment is learning to live within your means joyfully. I'll say that again. Contentment is living within your means joyfully. Now, some people can live within their means, but they don't do it joyfully. And some people are joyful, but they're not living within their means. Contentment is doing both well. And when you do these two together, you give yourself the best chance for a great gain. But let me talk about this ideal, because this ideal will give us a framework of how we understand finances and what we are to do with them here on earth. It's this. A mentor taught me this. First and foremost, you have to understand, where does money come from? You gotta understand this. Where does it come from? Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It begins with God creating. The scriptures will say that the earth belongs to the Lord and everything in it. And so your first idea of money has to be of a great giver, and his name is God. Giving to you. And central to the text is this idea of stewardship. Now, what is stewardship? In Greek, this word is oikonomia. And in the Greek language, the OI can actually be kind of in English, be an E. If you substitute the OI for E, it would look like economics or economy. And stewardship, biblical stewardship, is when a person is entrusted to rule over God's resources for God's glory. Let me just say that again. Stewardship is you being entrusted to rule over God's resources for God's glory. Here's what I believe. On every one of the dollars that we have, dollar bills, $10 bill, $20 bill, $50 bill, it says, in God we trust. And that is beautiful. But stewardship is God saying, I trust you. I trust you. I've entrusted you. I trust you, I trust you, I trust you. I trust you to rule over this, over these resources for my glory. And whenever you get paid, on the 30th or the 15th, maybe weekly, maybe nightly, from different tips of a restaurant or as a barista, wherever you get paid, it is God saying, I trust you to rule over the resources that I've given you for my glory. And when I learned that, it changed everything for me, because I had been brought up, God doesn't give, I earn. And it's really about me working my tail off to acquire, to achieve, and to promote my glory. And when you have a biblical understanding, it's God gives, because God trusts for you to rule his resources for his glory. But how do you do it? Some people might know these two, but then they don't necessarily know, what do I do and how do I do it when I get a paycheck? I want to tell you what my mentor taught me. My mentor taught me 3 ways for us to really do biblical stewardship well. The first one is serving. Serving. What do I mean by that? Serving is about investing in eternity, investing in heaven. investing that the good news continues to go out, investing in the reality that we want as many people to be in heaven with us. Serving from the Old Testament days was the idea of a tithe. It was right off the top. It was a priority test every time someone got paid to give a tenth back to the God who gave and entrusted them. But in the Jewish faith, they didn't give just a tithe. They gave 23% a year, which in talking to a friend of mine recently, he goes, man, we got a deal just giving 10%. But think about this, 10% they would give just to the temple, 10% they would give to the festivals, and then 3% was to charity. That was the Jewish way of doing it. 10%. This idea of giving God the first fruits, investing in eternity. But then there's this idea of saving. And saving, and what you've heard Bill talk about for a number of years, 10-10. This idea of putting 10% to tithe and then 10% right away to saving. And just putting it aside. And that is about investing in the future. Investing in the future, making sure that you have something for tomorrow. And when you flip to the scriptures, you see ideas about this, the importance of it, the wisdom of it. Typically what I do when I'm in my chair time, I try and read a proverb. Depending on what day it is in the month, I read that chapter. It's just an easy reminder. So on January 30th, I read Proverbs 30. And every time I'm reading the scriptures, I try to find a verse or maybe a idea that would connect to one of my kids. And then I try to leave them notes from time to time, just try to get their insight or spark a conversation. I came across this passage because my son, he's quirky. He loves creatures and animals and nature facts. And so in Proverbs 30, King Solomon, who happens to be one of the wisest people who ever lived, he talks about 4 small creatures, locusts, lizards, hyraxes, and ants. And he says, they're small, but they are wise. After watching them, I learned something. Hear what he says about the ants in Proverbs 30:25. Ants are creatures of little strength, yet they store up their food in the summer. So I read this. I write it down. I leave my son a note. I say, hey, tonight, I'd love to learn from you about why Solomon would say this about ants. So I ask him that night, and my son Emerson, he's 9, he goes, Dad, ants, they're tiny, but they're always working. And they're working, and they got food, and they got to store up. And I'm like, well, why do they got to store up? He goes, because winter's coming. I was like, smart kid. And I said, well, why would they store up? Because without food in a Chicago winter, they're dead. It's like, smart. And so here, Solomon, he's looking at these creatures, and he looks outside his palace, and he just sees these ants, and they understand this. And Solomon knows the benefit that comes from saving. Dave Ramsey will talk about that. Every one of us should have an emergency fund because life happens. And you should have $1,000, ideally, just set aside because you never know when something's gonna break. We learned this past week. No joke, we were going down to the basement, and all of a sudden, water was just dripping. Just dripping. But the weird thing is, it was dripping on the right side of our house, and all of our showers and bathrooms are on the left side. We couldn't figure it out. It was right underneath our 4-year-old daughter's bedroom, but we're like, what is going on? We called someone from Willow. They came out and cut a big chunk of drywall out in the basement. Water's just gushing down. And then it would stop. And about 10:15 p.m., for 3 nights in a row, water would just start gushing down, and we could not figure it out. And then the next morning, my wife, because she's very handy, me not so much, she goes, I got it. I know what happened. I said, what? She said, every night at about 8:30, 9 p.m., we are putting 2 gallons of water into a humidifier in Mercy's room. And all of a sudden, we realized that there was a crack in the back of that humidifier, and water was just leaking straight down behind her dresser and causing this. And she's like, oh, she was so frustrated and totally get it. But here's the deal. Honestly, I was like, life happens. And it was not that big of a stress. It was frustrating. It's not what I want to pay money. And sure, I'm probably going to Amazon and leave a nice review. But like, I'll tell you this. When you have that emergency fund, there's no stress. There's no tension. There's no angst. There's no fighting. It's like, life happens. Okay, we'll figure it out. But when people don't have that emergency, when all of it happens, stress comes on, tension comes in the relationship, they max out credit cards, and all of a sudden it becomes this downward spiral, and it affects us emotionally and physically and spiritually and relationally. And that's why the idea of saving and looking at little creatures like ants, man, and learning from them, gosh, it's so helpful. Ramsey will also say a good goal to have is to have 2 to 3 months set aside. That's hard, but it does take that chance just in case something happens that you're prepared. 10-10, and then the spending. And Bill talks about this, having 80%, trying to learn to be content, living off 80%. I was talking with Jeff Mannion many years ago, and I was asking him, what do you learn? He's a pastor in Michigan, and he just said, I'm walking through the book of Philippians, and I'm fascinated with how Paul keeps using this word joy over and over again, but he said, I am learning 9 difficult words. I was like, what is that? It goes, Philippians 4:11, I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I have learned to be content. I have learned to live within my means joyfully, whatever the circumstances. I have learned to be content whenever I'm walking through Nordstrom's. I have learned to be content whenever I open up the refrigerator and there's no food and I'm like, I should just go out again. I have learned to be content when my neighbor comes home with a brand new car. I have learned to be content. And the truth is, most of America hasn't learned that. We find ourselves feeling like there's not enough good to go around, more driven by scarcity, more fearful, more anxious, more frustrated, more angst-ridden. And truth be told, the 80% that God has given us to enjoy, many of us just don't because we keep looking at what we don't have. And I want you to understand, God wants you to enjoy. God wants you to experience. God's given you these resources to rule for his glory. And throughout the scriptures, joy is a part of it. Enjoyment is a part of it. But he wants you to live within your means joyfully. I think one of the fascinating pieces is so many of us acquiring stuff here that we can't even take into the next reality. Paul wants Timothy to understand this. Paul says in 1 Timothy 6:7, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. You can't take your shoe collection into heaven. You can't take your favorite jeans into heaven. You can't take all of the knickknacks into heaven. And the truth be told, we entered into this world one way and we will leave the same way. And it gives you some perspective of how am I actually spending my resources. Now, what's amazing to me about this is just this mathematical formula, godliness, conforming to God's ideal, plus contentment, living within my means joyfully equals great gain. Every one of us should really ask ourselves, what's the great gain? What do I gain by choosing godliness? What do I gain by being content? What do I gain by choosing to orient my finances towards this? What do I actually gain? I want to tell you, you gain something. And if you were to bring atheists, agnostics, and every world religion into a local pub and said, we're not going to leave until you agree on one thing, I will tell you this. There's one thing that every one of those people would agree on, and it has to do with a concept that was familiar to Jesus. In Acts 20:35, Paul quotes Jesus by just simply saying, it is more blessed to give than to receive. And in that book, God and Money, written by those two guys, Gabe and John, Greg and John, I want you to know something. They have this chapter based on these different religions and how they viewed charitable giving. Look what an atheist says, Richard Dawkins. He writes, "Let us try to teach generosity and altruism because we are born selfish." Or Buddhism. This is from Buddha. "Teach this triple truth to all. A generous heart, kind speech, and a life of service and compassion are the things which renew humanity." Hinduism, Hindu proverb, "They who give have all things. They who withhold have nothing." Islam, "You shall never be truly righteous until you give in alms what you dearly cherish." That's from the Quran. Or even Judaism, King Solomon again, "Whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. This too is meaningless." Every person would say that there is great gain when you learn to live with the reality